psychoanalytic theories concentrated on internal relationships and how they were also projected onto concepts of God and religion. I'll let Maria explain the rest. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to ask you to give Maria a warm welcome. Maria.
Thank you. I was just saying to my friends who are here to support me today that I do a fair bit of public speaking. I've never really been nervous, but I am today, and it occurred to me that today I'm going to be talking about a concept that cannot be observed directly and cannot really be measured in an objective way to a room full of atheists. So wish me luck. So I'm going to be talking about some psychoanalytic views about religion, and I'd actually forgotten exactly how complex my talk was going to be, so we're about to find out how I pull it off. And I want to start with Freud. So Freud is like the big daddy when you're talking about psychoanalysis. There's a couple of concepts that he came up with that we still use today, but most of the details of his theory have changed and have evolved, and actually evolved during his lifetime. He was very good at changing his view when he figured that something didn't work, and have evolved since his death as well. And the first concept that I really need to make quite clear is the one of the unconscious. And if you're not really going to go along with the idea of the unconscious as a driver for behavior, you might as well just leave now, because this whole talk is actually about that. What is the unconscious? The unconscious is a little bit like, it's every part of your mind that you don't have direct access to. And because we're unconscious of it, we actually don't know that much about it. There's a lovely line in Awakenings when the character that Dustin Hoffman's playing, like one of the psychiatrists looks at him and says, "Are you aware of the unconscious aggression you're displaying right now?" And he replies, "Well, if I were aware of it, it wouldn't be unconscious." And so this is kind of the problem that we have. But what Freud discovered was that there were things driving people's behaviors that were really kind of quite outside of their conscious cognition. They couldn't really tell you what it was. That they had some reasons as to why they might be doing what they were doing, but they didn't really seem to pan out. They didn't really make that much sense. In terms of scientific evidence for this, we do have actually quite a fair bit of evidence about unconscious influences on attention and on cognition, but really what Freud was talking about was foundations of personality that happened very early on, that we don't have access to, and that continue to be an influence throughout the lifetime. And that's another second really important part of his theory, which is early experiences are really influential in determining, really basically the rest of your life. It's not a deterministic theory, whatever happens in the first 2 to 5 years is what you're stuck with, but it's certainly a foundational thing. It's fairly hard to shift after that. The other thing that he came up with was the idea that humans are pleasure-seeking. Now, in psychoanalytic thought, this has changed, and it's changed considerably, but a lot of his views on religion are actually based on the idea that we're mainly pleasure-seeking people. We don't care where the pleasure comes from. We don't care the cost of the pleasure. If it feels good, we're going to do it. This is kind of basically how Freud viewed humanity. And he came up with 2 basic instincts. There's the life instinct, which is pleasure-seeking. This is where the libido comes in, that we're also wonderfully aware of. And then there's also the death instinct, which is basically an instinct that wants to keep us away from dying. We don't want to die, and so we have this instinct that, this is where our aggression is coming from. We're going to hurt people if they're going to try and hurt us, and that he called that the death instinct. And basically he figured that these 2 instincts, which are really powerful and the driver for all behavior, kind of get in the way of your manners, okay? Because if you're always seeking pleasure and you're always really quite ready to be aggressive towards something or someone when you don't like what they're doing, you're not really going to be a very good neighbor. And so he figured, okay, well, as humans were developing this idea of culture and society and civilization, they had to come up with something to try and restrict these drives that were pushing people to, have sex with whomever they want to, whenever they wanted to, and to really hit and kill anybody that they would have liked to, which is what he thinks would happen if we didn't have this unconscious to keep us safe. So what Freud is saying is the unconscious is there, kind of like the basement of the house of not a serial killer, but if you can think of a house basement, this is where you store all the bits that you're not really using or you don't really want people to see, and this is the unconscious. And he actually suggested that the unconscious was much bigger and much more influential than anything that we were aware of. He identified himself as Jewish, but he wasn't a religious man. He was actually an atheist. He said his parents were Jewish, but he didn't actually have a belief in a deity, nor did he see the need for a deity. And this led to a couple of really interesting papers on religion. And the first one is from 1907, and he wrote about obsessive actions and religious practice. And here he observed that a lot of religious practice was really quite similar to religious practice. So he's talking about ideas of anxiety, and he's talking about how we get rid of these anxieties. And what he noticed was that, this religion and obsessional thought actually share a couple of fairly important factors. And the first one was they both share a belief that you can change the reality that you live in through thought and symbolizing the thought through action. And for example, with obsessive compulsive disorder, you do have this belief, there's people who have a belief that if they, if they do something with numbers, let's say you reduce a number with several integers to that sort of one remaining number, there's a name for this process and I've just forgotten it. Let's say that 7 is your lucky number. If you can get those numbers to reduce back down to 7, then things are going to go well. And they're constantly adding up these numbers in their mind. So that would be an example of an obsessional thought. And what the person's actually believing there is saying, okay, well, if I do this and I get to 7, then I'm going to have luck. So they're going to change the way that the world works. This is obsessional thought. What Freud noticed was that religious thought kind of shared a lot of those qualities. If I pray hard enough to a god, if I ask nicely enough to this deity, then maybe my reality will change. If I ask for God to take away my blindness, or if I make if I pray and do really good deeds or do penance, maybe my child will be able to walk. And so there's this shared feature. And the other one was that both are a defense against anxiety and against the unknown. So with obsessive compulsive disorder, what you find is people are really quite highly anxious, and they're not really quite sure what's going to happen. They need reassurance, and so they go into ritualistic behavior. And it's actually called ritualistic behavior. And in terms of religion, it's kind of the same thing. You don't know what's going to happen. You don't know if little Johnny's ever going to walk after that accident, so you go into ritualistic behavior. You go to church, you pray, you ask people to share that chain on Facebook, you do all of these things in the hope that little Johnny will eventually walk again after, not wearing a helmet. No judgment. That's right. Thank you, Sally. No judgment. Make your children wear helmets. Okay. And the other thing Freud says in this paper is basically he's saying, okay, so we have this idea of religion, and religion is nothing other than a universal obsessional neurosis. So he's very much reduced to the level of essentially a mental illness. In his next paper, The Future of Illusion, he explores this theme a little bit more, and a couple of really fun ideas come out of this one. So he's saying, okay, humans have a need to understand nature. Primitive humans, they didn't really have the sciences, they really didn't, have this idea of where lightning came from, they didn't know any of these. It was quite an anxious thing because humans, kind of really like to know what's happening and why. So they came up with this idea of gods, and if you look at the evolution of religion, in those early religions, and certainly in some religions that we still have today, you had lots of different gods, and gods for lots of different things. So you had the god for thunder, and you had the god for the waves, and you had god for music, god for diarrhea. I don't know about that one. You and I are going to have to talk afterwards, because I might need to pray to that one. God for wine, and God bless that one. Thank you. Hallelujah. So you have all of these different gods that are kind of controlling these things that are really outside of human control. Humans can't control nature, so we're going to come up with a god for volcanoes and tsunamis. And so he thinks, okay, that's one of the reasons why humans have come up with gods. And religion is going to police a lot of these. So he's saying, okay, so now we have these deities, these things that are all powerful, and we can kind of make sense of them, and we can sacrifice to them. But we also have a fair amount of behaviors that are not really acceptable. So we need to restrict those behaviors. So this is the second part of what he's saying. And he's saying, okay, well, these drives are challenged by culture, in particular, the libidinal drive and the death drive. We don't want overly aggressive people, and we certainly don't want people who can't control their sexual impulses, because that leads to all sorts of funky things in terms of inheritance, and suddenly your neighbor's kid is actually the one getting your farm, and nobody wants that. So we're going to have to restrict this behavior. And how do we do it? Well, we're going to make people, we're going to have to give them up. Except these behaviors feel good. They feel really good, I mean, again, no judgment. But there's a cost to giving up these behaviors. And the cost is religion. This is Freud's theory. The cost of giving up these religions, the cost of culture, is essentially religion. And he comes up with this idea that we replace instinctual behaviors with obsessive behaviors. So in that earlier paper, we're seeing a comparison between the obsessive behaviors and the religious behaviors. And in this paper, he's saying, well, actually, we're replacing one for the other. Okay, you can't have sex, but what you can do is whip yourself until you bleed. Well, I mean, whatever you're into. And, certainly a lot of people actually mix the two still to this day. And this is, it's a fun thing that you can do with this theory. So instead of sex and aggression, we get prayer, we get penance, we get pilgrimage. I like pilgrimage. Actually, if I, as a good atheist, if I can ever spare a couple of months, I'm going to do one of those really long walks somewhere for something and look for shells. Self-flagellation, a favorite of mine. Self-harm, the martyrs. If you read the history of the martyrs in Catholicism, it's actually fairly extreme self-abuse and self-harm. It's really quite shocking. So what he's saying is, okay, there's a trade-off. And actually what Freud is saying is civilization is such a good thing. It is such a good and wonderful thing that we're actually willing to give up sex and killing people who piss us off for the sake of having the civilization. So it's a wonderful thing. This is some quotes, because there's another little fun thing about Freud. If you know anything about the early 1900s and the sciences, you'll know that anthropology was kind of a big deal at around that time. This is where Margaret Mead is getting her education, and all of these people that have a lot to do with that, the study of culture. And one of the views that was around at the time, that was a bit of a mixture of a few things, was that human development, and even going down to the embryo, kind of mirrored the evolution of humanity and then the evolution of human culture. So there's this view around pregnancy, and you would look at, what fetuses look like and what embryos look like, and okay, well, that one looks a bit like a fish, and the next one looks a little bit like a lizard, and then you've got kind of monkey and stuff, and so it's okay, well, actual physical development is kind of mirroring the evolutionary process. And there was a similar view in anthropology, which was human psychological development mirrored the development of humanity as a whole. And so this is what Freud is talking about in this quote. And he's saying that children, kind of just like our primitive ancestors, they would pass through these stages where they just had this, if you know any 2-year-olds, they do this. If they want something, they're out to get it. They don't really care. They're fantastic. If they're upset with you, they'll kick, they'll scream, they'll punch you. Sometimes they'll bite you. They don't see anything wrong with this. It's actually your fault for making them upset. And they kind of, sorry? Oh, so they they do all these great things. And so he's talking about the child's development. And one of my greatest fears is reading out loud in public, so I'm not going to read that one out to you, but I encourage you to read it. And the one below talks a little bit more specifically about religion, and he's basically saying, okay, well, just like children are kind of developing in this way and moving away from the childhood neurosis and moving into competent people in society, as society develops in an equal way, society will eventually have to let go of this idea of religion. And at the moment, he's saying, we're kind of halfway through that. We're moving towards secularism. He quite liked secularism. He was good that way. So that's a nice little paper. And here's some other ideas from Freud that are going to be really important in understanding, or can be quite useful in trying to understand how people use religion in ways that kind of make sense from an unconscious perspective. He came up with this internal psychic structure. the ego, the id, and the superego. Now, the ego is your representative. He's the guy you send out to the job interviews. He's the guy that, you're sending out to catch a plane because you don't want to get too nutty when you're catching a plane these days. So he's your ego knows how to behave. Ego's got manners. The id is the person you want out on a Friday night with you because the id doesn't care. The id is going to drink, the id's going to do whatever it wants. And it's kind of that sort of really childlike part, just really giving in to any impulse. And then he's got the superego, which he talked about as an internalized cultural voice or parental voice. So this is the voice of Father God telling you, no, you really can't do that. No, that was wrong. And he suggested that our personality was split up into these 3 different bits. So the superego's job is to suppress the drives and maintain socially appropriate behavior. So we kind of need the superego. Again, it's the price we pay for, living in society, as it were. The problem is it's not 100% efficient. And it can't be 100% efficient, because if it was, no one would ever reproduce. And then humanity would die out. And that's a really bad thing. Well, it might not be. I mean, the rabbits might think us, but, and the rhinoceros, they'd be pretty pleased. So there's this idea that sometimes these unspeakable things kind of have to come up and find some kind of expression, but in socially acceptable ways. And again, religion is kind of there to regulate this. Religion is saying, okay, well, your sexual impulses can come up, but only within these contexts. And we do find that, not all, but in fact most of the world's religions do have some pretty strict rules around sexual behavior, who you can have sex with, when you can have sex with. Some religions are more picky than others, but I think we can all agree they all care they care a lot and deeply. They also have, religions have a lot of rules around aggression, who you can hurt and when is a war a just war and when isn't it, really shouldn't go around killing your father, that Oedipus guy was a really bad guy. Freud was very fond of Oedipus, but religion is not. You all know Oedipus? Yeah, okay, good. So these are some of the ideas. Now, the other thing that Freud came up with is the idea that bits that we didn't like in ourselves, and this was further developed by other people, but he's the one that kind of began with this idea that bits that we don't like about ourselves, or things that are really intolerable, like sexual desire for someone that we shouldn't have sexual desire for, would get projected onto someone else. He's the one that's coming up with this, and he's coming up with it within the context of sexuality, but it's equally applied to the idea of religion, and in particular the idea of the devil. Now, I should say at this stage, Freud was mostly talking about experience with Judeo-Christian traditions. There's a fair amount of work that's been written about psychoanalytic theory and Islam, and there's a very good book that I've kind of read halfway, but I didn't bring it here tonight. But it's a fairly good book. I think it's called Psychoanalysis and the Problem of Islam, and it's really about psychoanalysis and radical fundamentalist Islam, and it's a fairly good read if you've got a spare couple of weeks, because it's dense. What am I talking about? Oh, that's right. So we're using religion as a way to kind of split off bits that we don't like about ourselves, and this is where the concept of the devil comes in, because the devil is a really, really handy concept. The devil made me do it. It wasn't me. It was the devil. The devil comes up as a snake, the devil comes up as temptation, the devil's kind of like a really nasty guy. And so all of these impulses that we have, well, they don't really belong to us because we're all good. And we're all good because we were made by God. The devil is the one that makes us do it. So that's one way in which this idea, the devil, well, by God, of course. Well, see, what happened was that God made all of these angels, and then one of them kind of believed in this free thought, and so he got kicked out and made into the devil. Well, actually, there's something, and Freud, as an aside, and just because this is fun, another thing that Freud really believed in was the idea that myth, like this, like the Greek myth, and particularly the Greek myth, but also religious myth, revealed something really quite intrinsic about human nature. This is why he used things like the Oedipal complex and later the Electra complex and a couple of other things, fun things to really explain why people might be behaving in a particular way. And he did a similar thing with religious myth. And there's this idea that, if you look at the actual history of the devil and where the devil's coming from in Christianity and Judaism, the devil kind of gets kicked out of heaven for believing in free choice. And
a third of the angels went with him. 1/3 apparently.
That's right. So what we can assume from that is about 33% of the human population has enough brains to believe in free choice. Maybe even radical existentialism, but that's for another day. Right. And now I want to move on to the object relations school, which is really where things start getting, they get fun. Object relations, it belongs to a few people. Melanie Klein is really the main person, if you want to look into it, who really drives this theory forward. But she wasn't working on her own. She wasn't coming up with these theories on her own. And Fairbairn is one of the first ones that kind of comes and says, well, you know what? Humans are not really pleasure-seeking. We are object-seeking. And what that means is what we want most of all isn't physical pleasure. It's actually a relationship with someone else. Because the relationship with someone else, the main carer, is the one that's going to give us everything else that we need. So he's saying the primary preoccupation is with establishing that really good relationship. And what comes with that is that, an infant's born, an infant wants a really good relationship with the main carer, usually the mother. So I think in a lot of psychoanalytic literature we use the image of the mother. The infant wants that really good relationship. And there's a lot of really fearful aspects about that relationship that are happening before the child is verbal, before the child actually has the mental capacity to figure a couple of things out, quite a few things out actually. And so there are aspects of that relationship that need to be split off because they are intolerable for the infant. So Melanie Klein comes up with this incredibly fun idea of the good breast and the bad breast. And I think if any ladies here have breastfed, you might be able to relate to that idea. Because one of them's usually better than the other. But that's not really what she meant. What she meant was...
What if you got twins?
No, yeah. So what she really meant was this infant in the really early days has this relationship with this really good breast. This breast that's there to give it milk whenever the infant wants it. It's a fantastic breast. But there's also this really bad breast that doesn't show up the minute the infant thinks about it. And this breast is absent. It's an abandoning breast. It's a very bad breast. And so the infant kind of splits that one off into a part of the personality that is unconscious. The infant will not later have any real access to these ideas. And the other one, the other thing that kind of tends to really get split off in the object relations field is this idea of the exciting libidinal object. So this would be the kind of really exciting breast that taunts the baby with the possibility of milk but doesn't really come through. Again, it's this bad thing and we don't want to have a thing to do with it. And what these people are saying is, in those early days, this infant is forming things that these things are being established that are going to be present in the infant's personality for the rest of that person's life. And there are aspects of this relationship which by necessity are intolerable because no mother is always there 100% of the time with the breast. If you're really into this stuff, you can go and read about Bion, and Bion actually talks about how we need that disappointment in order to even begin thinking, but again, that's a talk for another day. And the other thing that Melanie Klein came up with, which is really useful when trying to understand religion from this perspective, is the idea of the positions. And she talked about two basic positions. And the first one is the paranoid schizoid. Things are good or they're bad. And the bad is not just little bad, it's like big bad. These are the monsters under the bed bad. The things you can't see, they're going to come and get you and they want to kill you. And then she spoke about the depressive position, which is possibly one of the most poorly named things in the history of psychology, because the depressive position is actually a really good thing to have. I know, weird, right? So what she's saying is the depressive position is when you finally figure out, oh my God, both breasts belong to the same person. This is, what do I do, And so when you achieve this position, something really tricky happens for this infant. They go, holy, I've been hating this breast all of this time, right? Turns out the breast is attached to the good one. What if I destroy the good one by trying to kill the bad one? This is a really, really bad thing. And so again, things start getting split off. Okay, well, we're not really going to think about that. This is generally a really bad thing. So when we start looking at this, we start coming up with a couple of different possibilities to explain religious belief. So basically, from this perspective, it's fairly easy to formulate an argument that says religion is actually about people being kind of stuck in this paranoid schizoid position, which is a very primitive way of functioning. It's the idea that, things are either good or they're bad, either with God or the devil, you're either with us or against us, that kind of thing.
Team Australia.
Team Australia would be another thank you. Team Australia or Team elsewhere. Religion isn't the only paranoid schizoid philosophical position that we can, look at. There's quite a few others, and maybe we can have some fun naming some. No? Sport? Well, sport's a good one. And the truth is, what Melanie Klein was saying, it's not, okay, we've evolved from paranoid schizoid, we've moved on to depressive, and we're going to stick to depressive until we die. Which kind of sounds awful. But there's a nice sentiment behind that. She's saying we can actually revert to an earlier position at times of stress. When things get tough, we can revert back to the paranoid schizoid position. In this idea, God would hold all the goodness. God is the good parent, the devil is the bad parent, and kind of think back to those early Freud ideas around this stuff as well. Now, there's a couple of really interesting observations. This idea that, from an object relations perspective, this idea that we can go back to an earlier form of functioning. We don't completely regress. We don't completely regress in every way, but we do go back in certain aspects of our life to an earlier form of functioning. And these are the kinds of things. Maybe it's the next one. Hang on. Yeah, I'll go through this slide first because it makes more sense that way. These are the kinds of things that we see when, for example, religiosity increases after a crisis. For example, after September 11, when the planes flew into the Twin Towers, you immediately see a spike in church attendance in the US, and it goes up, and it's quite a significant spike. The problem is it doesn't last. So what we can, if we're looking at this from an object relations psychoanalytic perspective, we would say, okay, something really awful has happened. People are feeling under threat, so they're going to revert back to this earlier form of functioning, which is the paranoid schizoid, and they're going to be going to church and they're going to be saying, we're all really, really good, and those people out there are really, really bad. What's really interesting about this is I remember from the media at the time and from talking to people at the time is that the initial reaction of most people in the US wasn't going back to the paranoid schizoid position. It was actually more ambivalent. They kind of sat at the depressive stage for a little while and said, what have we done to really upset people this much? Maybe we've done something. It didn't last very long because I think in times of really high stress, it really is a lot easier to go back to the paranoid schizoid position. Another time when it becomes really popular for adults is at times of divorce, or just generally any breakup in a relationship. So you can kind of see it there as well. When people, that you have this loving relationship, but at some point in your life you like this person enough to, want to share your life with them, then you have this divorce, and people often do revert to this paranoid schizoid position of he's bad, I'm good, he wants all my money, whatever it is. And what you normally see actually from a couple's perspective, what you normally see with that is that most couples go through that stage, but again it kind of tapers off and people go back to a different way of functioning unless they have a personality disorder, in which case you're kind of stuck with whatever it is that you got in the first place. So you can see the usefulness of that concept. And I'll just go back to the previous slide. Okay, and here I'm going to talk a little bit about these ideas around transference and projection. Do you all know what transference is? Really? So, transference is a great concept. It begins with Freud, and at first, I'm just going to embarrass you now. That's my friend JV, and she thinks it's voodoo. Thanks. So transference is a concept that goes all the way back to Freud, where he's saying things that have happened really early on are kind of relived in later life, but we don't actually remember them. You know, we don't remember what it is that we're reliving, but we're kind of reenacting it with something else. And this is something that you can probably already begin to see, okay, well, yeah, this kind of makes sense in terms of religious thought. Because if you look at a lot of religious traditions, they're actually a reinterpreting or a reliving or a reenactment of some fairly early stuff. In terms of theory, one of the things that tends to get reenacted through religion quite a lot is the absence of the father. So you go back to most religions, and in particular the Judeo-Christian and Islam, and they're marked by the idea of the absence of the father. And I think...
Jedi.
Sorry? And the Jedi... Well, the Jedi religion as well, marked by the absence of the father, you know. Oh, Obi. Just... That bit of it just still gets to me. So if we look at social structure and how it's worked through human history, fathers are not really that present in infants' lives. And this is one of the things that's getting reenacted in religion. But it's getting reenacted in this really kind of psychotic way where the father is all good, but sometimes the father is all bad. You know, you've got the good God, but then you've also got the vengeful God. It's kind of an idea that, okay, you've got this absent father, you don't know when he's going to show up, and you actually don't know what mood he's going to be in. So that's, you know, one possible way of looking at it. And you can see this in Islam as well, you know, this idea of the father that isn't there. So that would be something a little bit like transference, and transference kind of blends in with the idea of projection as well. When we're talking about sort of wide social philosophy or politics, the two concepts blend in quite easily, because projection at an individual level is a bit of a reciprocal thing. We call it projective identification and introjection and stuff, but I won't bore you with that bit. But projection, it really is also about projecting qualities of yourself onto someone else. Things that are intolerable, either because they're really good or because they're really bad. So we can project, you know, again, that relationship with the absent father kind of makes perfect sense when it comes to God. Projections of evil, you know, this idea, well, God is really good, so we need the really, you know, the bad bit, so we create this idea of the devil. We can also project competence, and this is a really interesting one. We can project our power away. And one fun thing about psychology and psychiatry is this idea of the religious delusions. I think you would mostly be familiar with the idea that most people with psychosis develop delusion. Well, those people with psychosis who develop delusions tend to have religious delusions. With that, you're kind of familiar with that. So they're all kind of talking to God. Well, one really interesting thing is that as society becomes more secularized, this phenomenon is actually dwindling down. So what we see now in psychiatric wards isn't so much people with, you know, God delusions, points to Dawkins, but we actually see them with delusions about police, about the Queen. I'm also a fellow with a really lovely one about the Queen. The police commissioner, army, all sorts of wonderful things. The idea of aliens is, you know, becoming more and more popular.
Those three kiddies did see Saint Bernadette.
Sorry, what's that?
Those three kids did see Saint Bernadette.
Oh, the Portuguese girls. Yeah. And make no doubt, they saw her. They did. Actually, as an aside from psychoanalytic theory, it's really easy to see things that are not there. It's also really easy to hear things that are not there. And there's a really great theory about random firings of the brain that happen and that kind of need to be interpreted, but that's, again, for another day.
The flying spaghetti monster is there though, isn't it?
The flying spaghetti monster is real.
Oh, good, thanks.
Yeah. Thank you. And yeah, religion. So there's this idea, when we look at all of this, that religion is a regression to a more primitive form of functioning. That's basically the, you know, that's, how long have I talked for?
You're okay for a while, yeah?
Oh, really? Gosh, I can run out. Do we have any questions? Because I don't know how much I've got. Oh, that's it. All right, questions. Yes, thank you.
So you were talking about the rise of religion after 9/11, and I'm wondering if there's ever been any studies in the rise of superstition after these events. So, for example, you had statistics on church attendance after 9/11, but what about, and you probably wouldn't have statistics on this, but I'm wondering if there's ever been any studies done with something like this, the rise of people who wouldn't step on the cracks in the pavement after 9/11?
The answer to that, it does go up, but that's not seen as a religious thing. That's actually seen to relate to anxiety. What Freud is saying is that it doesn't actually make a difference, that religion is just another form of expressing anxiety. But we do see an increase in obsessional thought, in anxious behavior, and in depressed behavior after a crisis.
Indeed, I was in the US 2004, and for the last 6 months, about 6 months before Bush's election, every single day terror alert was in like an extreme, suddenly. And it caused most people to vote against Kerry.
It's called children overboard in Australia.
Yeah. Look, the truth is that these things, I mean, we talk about these anxious, I think the idea of groupthink came up before, and the unconscious is a similar thing. And it works at a societal level, it works at a very particular level, which is it's very good at increasing anxiety. If you can make people afraid, you can actually manipulate their behavior really well in ways that people are not particularly aware of, because it fits in. Basically what psychoanalytic theory is saying is your fears are never really that far behind. You haven't left your childhood fears behind. You're kind of just carrying them in a little pocket where you don't have conscious access to them. So yeah, you're carrying them in the basement, and people can actually trigger them. Events can trigger them, and that's one of the best ways to manipulate large groups. In fact, large groups are not really clever.
It was right after Bush's neocons were proven to be liars. So we're talking about the entire US is disgusted by them, but then they still won the election because they literally did this terror alert.
And
like every day there was a bathroom bomb in my school, in CNN, BBC, every day there was some sort of bomb threat.
And again, from a psychoanalytic perspective, what Freud was saying and what everyone after Freud has said is, no matter what you know, and you can know whatever it is that you like, none of that is going to be as important to how you behave as what you're afraid of. People will go to just about any length to get rid of what they're afraid of, and fear rarely ever makes any sense. We're afraid of sharks, but that really doesn't make sense. We should be really afraid of buses, because more of us get killed by them, but no one's afraid of... Where is the fear of buses?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about anxiety, because we're talking about anxiety like it's a bad thing.
No, it's a good thing.
And there's a lot going on in the world at the moment that's not quite right.
Yeah.
I've heard the idea that if you're feeling anxious, it's because you're a human being. What do you think?
I think that's absolutely correct. I think anxiety gets a really bad rap. But in fact, and this isn't just psychoanalytic thought, but it's just about any thought, aside from maybe the more extreme cognitive behavioral therapists out there, most people will agree anxiety is actually a really good thing. Anxiety gets you out of bed in the morning. If that cortisol didn't rise, didn't go up in the mornings, didn't have a peak, you'd still be in bed drinking a mojito. You just wouldn't bother. We need anxiety to function, and anxiety is designed to keep us safe. So it's actually a survival mechanism. Where ideas around the unconscious come in to deal with anxiety is where we need to become anxious about things that are actually quite natural, like sex. And you're not really going to be able to make an entire population anxious about sex unless you can make it something, something that's really quite dangerous in some way.
So, I was going to say, in your practice, where do you draw the line between someone being religious and mentally ill?
All right. So, let's see. It's hard. It's hard. I think there are two... I think sometimes you can kind of tell, okay, this is a personality thing. When it's a psychosis, it's usually really clear because it's not just the religious stuff, it's a few other things going on. Mostly psychotic people put you to sleep. If you're talking to someone and you're wanting to fall asleep and you've no reason to, it's because they're really lost it. But I think, and here's the interesting thing, and this is my own perspective. I know, and I've certainly worked with people who have a very deep faith, who are very deeply religious people. But I don't, I'm working with them and I don't particularly have a problem with religiosity because it's a fairly mature religiosity and they're not around, it's not really a psychotic thing. It's really kind of reminiscent of, how many of you are familiar with Kierkegaard? Okay, so it's kind of really, it's kind of reminiscent of that faith of Kierkegaard where he's really talking about this idea of, look, there is doubt in this, but this is what I'm going to choose. I'm not 100% sure, but there's doubt, and I'm taking that leap of faith. And that's a fairly mature sense of religiosity, and I don't have a problem with that. But then sometimes it's quite clear. But I couldn't tell you the cutoff point, and it's frustrating, and I don't know how much supervision I've had around that.
You talk a lot about Judeo-Christian and Islam. How does this map to, especially sort of multiple God, polytheistic type cultures, and like Hinduism, where you got lots of different, you don't have an absolute father, you've got
yeah, lots of that. Actually fairly well. So Freud, okay, he's a wee bit racist, he's a little bit ethnocentric. Also had some issues with women, I'm not going to lie. But basically he looked at those religions with lots of different gods as just earlier, more primitive forms of religion. But that's Freud's perspective. Now, from a modern perspective, when we look at religions, for example, like Catholicism or Christianity generally, they're really not that different to the religions with lots of different gods or hierarchical god structures.
But other, like Catholicism, definitely not. Catholicism is like a form of faith. But
as opposed to Anglicanism.
Monotheistic religions, like Islam is very, very monotheistic.
Yeah.
And that would be very different from a Hindu view of the world, where you do have you have thousands of gods. You've got people that pop up all over.
From Freud's perspective, basically Islam is more advanced as a religion. That's basically how he explains it. So originally you've got men who are developing these religions to explain lots of different things with lots of different gods, and that as man begins to gain some mastery over the environment, lots of the different gods are no longer necessary, and you just kind of need one large unconscious out there just to hold the bits of yourself that you're not quite comfortable with.
In the Prado, they've got religious art where Mary is kind of squirting milk from her breast in a straight arc into the mouths of the open-mouthed saints. Is that the good breast or the bad breast?
I'm going to go with good. Although some might say the good breast would allow you to get a little closer. So that's where some of Freud's thoughts come in handy, and his idea that religion is an expression of something that is core and innate and goes on in the mind of everybody. So there's an idea in that whatever religious thought you have, whatever myth you have, is going to be mirrored in different cultures, and it's going to make sense at some level to everybody. This is the idea of the archetypes. So when people are borrowing a religion, when they're kind of just taking it on because they trust or whatever it is, or maybe because they've been forced to, they're not taking anything new or completely alien to themselves. And it's something that we can also see in the idea later on that comes from the object relations school about projective identification. People project things onto other people. So I can, look at someone and think, unconsciously they might remind me of someone. And I might think because they remind me of that person, they're probably really nasty and judgmental. I mean, a personal example, there's someone that really I have absolutely no reason to hate, but from the moment I met her, I just cannot stand this woman. I cannot stand her. And after a lot of work, and it's like, why am I reacting this way to this person? I actually realized it was the way she chewed her biscuits. And go with me on this.
We talked about Mary.
No, it's not Mary. She chewed her biscuits in a very particular way that reminded me of someone who's got a lot of power in an influence in my life, and also it's kind of really judgmental. Now, what's really interesting about this woman is she really couldn't quite, because she's not a judgmental person, couldn't quite relate. So I was probably treating her in ways. I was projecting onto her these things. You're going to be judgmental, you're going to be this, you're going to be that. And I was treating her in this particular way, but she couldn't really take that on board. She couldn't introject that. And so, it gave me a chance to really think about, okay, well, she's not quite reacting the way I need her to react for this to be true, and therefore I need to revise my assumptions. So that's a bit of a process that goes on for people all the time. In terms of religion, what Freud is saying is that they're kind of easily transferable because they'll make sense to everybody. It just makes sense. And a really good example of that you can see in the Spanish conquest of the Americas, where what they've got is a whole bunch of people who are out killing the indigenous population, and then along come the Jesuits and they say, no, we're not going to kill people, we're going to convert them. And how are we going to convert them? We've got the saints. We'll give them the saints. We'll say, look, all of these gods that you've got, we've got them. They're called saints. We just put another layer on it, which is like top dog. And he's God. And so this is, and you could see that as a bit of a borrowed religion, but in fact it's not what they're doing. What the Jesuits were in fact doing was saying, look, this will make sense to you, take it. And of course it did make sense, so people took it on. And if you, to this day, if you travel through in the indigenous Americas, you see the cults of the saints as being really significantly stronger than you would expect it to, and sometimes a lot stronger than the cult of this idea of God.
Yeah. They haven't been told about all the gold that was stolen from South America, are they?
I married a Spanish guy and tried to get some back, but it didn't work out.
So, do you agree with the last statement here that with enough development people will eventually let it go?
I like to think so.
Yes, church attendance is down.
I think the church will argue against this, and the church has for some time stopped defending or trying to argue or really engage with the idea of science. What they just have kind of gotten into this mood where they're saying, no, attendance isn't down, people will come back, people still believe. But the truth is, if you look at the numbers, it is declining. Less and less people, we now have a really strong part of society that identifies as, as Freud would predict, as we move along, some people would sort of be further along here, and then some people are kind of moving towards it. So you've got people who are completely secular. A large proportion of society identifies as spiritual but not religious. And that section of society is growing. And it's spiritual but not religious, kind of like your entry drug, That's your pot.
So when
and
that there says development, is that evolutionary development or some other?
It's a social development. It's a cognitive development. Yeah. There was, hang on.
So in the beginning of the talk, you just you mentioned like we are curious as species, so we impose God to answer some of the things, right? Like the thunder and all the nature things. Then why we stop being curious now? As if people
we haven't stopped being curious. We've just got the scientific method now.
No, like people more tend to believe in things than rather than disbelief or questioning things. Okay, you believe in God, but that doesn't make sense with that, or conflicting thoughts and more interrogating on the thoughts and going to that path.
Are you referring to the fact that most of the world comes across as stupid?
No comments.
No, I think one of the things that happens when you begin to have a discourse around issues is where there hasn't been a need to excuse or disagree before, there now is one. So 100 years ago, maybe 200 years ago, this wouldn't have been happening. Religion wouldn't have been under attack, and nobody would have had to justify anything because you were either religious or you were religious. They were your two options, What do you want? Do you want charcoal or grey? These are your two options. You've got nothing else. Whereas now you do have dissenting points of view. And what happens when you've got dissenting points of view is you begin to hear the crux and you begin to hear the arguments. So there's a whole bunch of people who are now kind of saying, no, we need the intelligent design in schools. I mean, would have never happened 50 years ago.
She's about to turn into the hole.
Sorry guys, just 2 more questions and then we'll call it a night.
There was one there first.
Is there a difference between religion and spirituality? If so, what is it and how do you distinguish?
In my mind, no. And because I have quite a strong belief in no, I'm not that good at answering that question. I actually think they're one and the same thing. I think the defining feature of both is a belief in something other than the physical universe.
Other than the physical universe means other than that which I am aware of as the physical universe, or what does it mean?
Right, okay, so, obviously I believe in the unconscious, so I don't necessarily believe the physical universe is made up of things I can see. But for me, spirituality, when I hear spirituality, what I hear people saying is there's something other than this physical universe, which we don't yet know. We're saying, okay, I believe there's a physical universe. There are things that we don't know or see or can measure in the physical universe. We've only recently been able to observe black holes properly and actually still not quite. Higgs boson is another example, things that we kind of think should be there, but we can't see, and slowly we're beginning to uncover those. That to me is the physical universe, and it doesn't mean that I'm not going to believe in something I can't see. It just means that I don't really believe there's anything outside of whatever is here. When I hear spirituality, when I hear people saying I'm spiritual, my interpretation of that is the saying, whatever it is that's here, whatever it is that's here in this universe, I believe there is something other. And I think Freud had a fellow that he exchanged some mails with. I was going to say emails, but there weren't emails. And his friend of his used to talk about religion as this desire for this big oceanic feeling. And Freud said, this is a feeling that's completely lacking in me. And I don't have this oceanic feeling. For me, spirituality is a little bit like that oceanic feeling. And I think of atheism as not really having that feeling.
Has Freud's psychoanalytic theory been demonstrated empirically?
In some regards, some aspects of it, yes. For example, we do now know that there is such a thing as unconscious influence on cognition. We know this through attention studies and through cognitive studies, processing speeds. We know that we can affect these things by exposing people to things that they're not actually aware of, that they don't really know that they're being exposed to. So we know that part of it. We can't really perform an experiment on the long-term effects of this because that, we've got ethics committees. Another part of psychoanalytic theory, and this is psychoanalytic theory, but not necessarily Freud. You can't judge psychoanalytic theory by Freud because that would be a bit like saying, Newton is all there is to physics. There's a lot that happened after Newton. So there are other aspects of psychoanalytic theory that have really quite an enormous amount of evidence, and attachment theory is probably the best example of that. Attachment theory is a psychoanalytic theory. Bowlby was a psychoanalyst. He was very interested in the early effects, the effects of early relationships on personality formation, and he found an overwhelming amount of evidence. And attachment theory is still the gold standard in a lot of studies in terms of how people perform in relationships, resilience. We're still using those tests, and it's been further developed to be applied to adults as well. So there is evidence. There are other psychoanalytic concepts that we're beginning to get some evidence for now. Just with some neurological studies in terms of mirror cells, people are saying, okay, well, this is the foundation for both, empathy and the idea of projection and projective identification. We can kind of see it. We can probably, if we go down this particular rabbit hole, we'll be able to find some evidence. But in terms of the broad theory, like the whole theory, no one's ever really tested it. It's fairly difficult. But if you test the individual bits of it, there is some pretty good evidence for some of the major parts of it. The other one is the concept of theory of mind, which we haven't really spoken about today, but that's another one that we have some fairly good evidence for. So in the object relations school, there's this kind of necessary stage of development where the baby doesn't know the difference between what's me and what's the other. And we actually also have some fairly good evidence now, and we call it theory of mind. It's this idea that, you know, I'm not everything and people are separate from me. And